Good morning. Hope you are all well. I don't know how familiar you are with like Greek and Roman mythology. That's right. We're just diving right in. But I do know that you know many of the names of these gods and goddesses because they're a part of our everyday vocabulary, right? We say them. I'll give you some examples. The planets in our solar system, they're all named after Greek gods and goddesses: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Neptune, Uranus, and Pluto, who got kicked out of being a planet, which is unfortunate. When we wanted to send people to the moon, we named the program that was designed to do that Apollo. Our athletes, the greatest ones, have endorsed clothing made by, and we have worn clothing made by Nike. Some of the best movies that have ever been made start out with that TriStar logo. You know what I'm talking about? It says TriStar across the top, and there's a white horse with wings. That's Pegasus. Okay. How about this? Every 4 years, 3.6 billion people tune in to watch the Olympic Games, which originated 2,700 years ago in Greece as these celebrations in honor of Zeus. So that's just lightly scratching, very lightly scratching the surface of how prevalent names from Greek and Roman mythology are to our brains. We know these names, and they continue to have influence in our culture. However, here's the thing. I bet that none of us have ever had lunch with, had a serious conversation with, or even know of someone who maintains a belief that any of these gods or goddesses are real. Now, someone came up to me after last service and they're like, "You're wrong," because I know somebody, and that's fine. But some of you do. But I bet most of you don't, right? I bet most of us don't. I would actually guess that most people in this room, you've never actually met someone who has a belief in the Greek or Roman pantheon of gods. And you might find it interesting, right? People might study it, but you'd be hard-pressed to find anyone that believes that the stories surrounding their legend are true. Now, that is not the case for Paul and the first Christians as they're traveling around the Roman Empire, and they're going into all these little cities, and they're meeting people who have real beliefs in these gods and goddesses. They model their lives around worshiping them. Their cities are sometimes built around temples dedicated to them and shrines. And the rituals involved in worshiping these gods are actually a part of their everyday lives. So when Paul and his friends go into these cities with this message, what it does is it shakes the foundation of their cities. It challenges the assumptions that underlay their worldview. Okay? Now, when that happens to us, when that happens to any human, whether it's an opinion, a message, an event, a set of circumstances, when the core assumptions that we have based our worldview on are challenged, we typically respond in fear. We respond. It makes us afraid. We don't know what to do with it. It might come out as anger. It might come out as arrogance. It might come out as sadness. But ultimately what's happening is that we're afraid. We're afraid that someone is pushing on something that might cause our whole Jenga thing to just fall in on itself, right? And so we react out of fear. So this is what's going to happen in this text, is Paul's going to go in with this message, and the people in Ephesus are going to respond out of fear. Now, like most of the cities that Paul goes to in the New Testament, Ephesus is a thriving city. It's a strategically located and affluent city because of its role in trade. It's a seaport in what we now know as Western Turkey, and it's home to at least 200,000 people. We sometimes think of these cities in our brains as like these little podunk towns. That's not true. A lot of these places, they're really large, okay? 200,000 people live in this city alone. And historians say it was recognized by its inhabitants as the most important trading center in all of Asia, okay? It's also an intellectual and political powerhouse in Asia. I brought a few pictures of the ruins because you could get on a plane, fly over, see them if you want. These are real places. This is the front of the library. This is a really impressive library, and kind of made Ephesus a home for a lot of intellectuals, a lot of people who were studying things. This is just one of the roads that kind of overlooks the city. And this road actually, we know, used to be lined with oil lamps and statues, so it was beautiful. It's not as impressive now as it was back then. But you can imagine walking into one of these beautiful Greek cities with this amazing, or this is a Turkish city, but amazing architecture, okay? And there's oil lamps lining the streets and statues everywhere, and it's a really affluent, thriving place. So that's the kind of environment that Ephesus is. That's the kind of environment that Paul walks into. And here's what happens. This is an amazing story. Starts in chapter 19, verse 23. It says, about that time, no little disturbance broke out concerning the way. A man named Demetrius, a silversmith who made silver shrines of Artemis, brought no little business to the artisans. So he gathered them together with the workers of the same trade and said, men, you know that we get our wealth from this business. You also see and hear that not only in Ephesus, but almost the whole of Asia, this Paul has persuaded and drawn away a considerable number of people by saying that gods made with hands are not gods. And there's danger not only that this trade of ours may become into disrepute, but also that the temple of the great goddess Artemis will be scorned, and she will be deprived of her majesty that brought all Asia and the world to worship her. So this guy named Demetrius is causing some trouble. Companies promote their products in a lot of different ways. Okay, some of you own companies even. All of you watch commercials. So if you look at commercials, if you look at signs and other marketing tools, you'll notice that a lot of those things are designed to convey one single message to you as a consumer, which is this: you can trust us. We stand for something. We are a reputable company. It might sound something like we have an A+ rating with the Better Business Bureau. You've seen that, right? Might say family owned and operated. Right? And at the end of that, it might say since, 1870. Right? We've been around for a long time. We've been servicing this area for a long time. We're a trusted name. Sometimes you'll see something like we invest back into our community, or we're local. We love our community. All of these statements are designed from a marketing perspective to communicate you can trust us. We are trustworthy. And why is that? Well, because that's really all a company has. Right? Reputations are really important if you want to stay in business. Now, Demetrius may have been a lot of things, including a nightmare for Paul, as we'll see, but above all, he's a human. He's a husband, a father maybe, a city leader. And he sees the implications for this message that Paul is preaching, and he thinks about his family. He thinks about his friends. He thinks about his city. He thinks about their economy, and he decides, well, we've got to do something to stop this. So he leverages his influence that he has, which is seemingly pretty significant, to gather a group of people to call Paul out and then kick Paul out. That's kind of the objective of this whole thing. And he's shrewd in the way that he approaches it because he makes two arguments. The first argument is this is bad for small business. Okay, Paul's message is actually hurting our small businesses. So Demetrius was a silversmith. That means that he made his living by participating in this industry that manufactured little mini take-home gods. Right? You could take these things and you could set them up in your homes and you could worship them. And that was a big part of what Demetrius was doing. And there's lots of other people in Ephesus that are doing the same thing. It's a booming industry in Ephesus of the time. So if you think of Demetrius not as just some jerk that wants to cause trouble for Christians, but as a small business owner, and you think of the thousands of other people in Ephesus that own small businesses that are participating in this, you can kind of understand why there's some fear here, right? He's trying to put us out of business. That's the first argument. This is bad for small business. You know why? Because Paul is saying these little gods we're making, they're not actually God. They're not gods at all. Well, that's not very nice, because that's our whole marketing slogan, right? Buy your God and put it in your house. Like if we can't market these things as gods, we have no business, right? So he's attacking our business. That's the first argument. The second one is brilliant because he takes that same argument, Paul's statement, these little gods are not gods at all, and he turns it around and he says, he is actually endangering our worship in this goddess named Artemis. He's suggesting that Paul might be robbing this Greek goddess, Artemis, of her glory, of her majesty. Now, this was a powerful point to everyone who's sitting there, and the reason is because Artemis was a real important goddess in that city. In mythology, Artemis is the daughter of Zeus, the twin sister of Apollo, and Ephesus was home to her cult. Okay, it was the epicenter of the people that worshipped her, and her temple was even there. It was spectacular. The Temple of Artemis was the first building known to be constructed completely of marble. You've heard of the Parthenon in Athens. Well, this one was 4 times larger than that. So it's massive in scale. It was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. And it must have been pretty spectacular because one renowned Roman engineer compared it to the other wonders of the world when he wrote this. I've seen the walls and hanging greens of ancient Babylon, the statue of Olympian Zeus, the Colossus of Rhodes, the mighty work of the high pyramids, and the tomb of that guy. But when I saw the temple at Ephesus rising to the clouds, all these other wonders were put in the shade. That's a pretty incredible statement. Like the temple to this goddess Artemis is so much better than all of the other wonders of the world. I'm going to show you what it looks like now. There it is. It's not as impressive as it used to be. Like literally it's this, like the puddle of water, not the thing off in the distance. This thing right here. Okay, whatever. I thought it was funny. Forget you guys. So Artemis, the goddess, is a big deal to the citizens of Ephesus, and so is her temple. So Demetrius hits a home run with these arguments. They're both based on fear. You're going to lose your business, and the goddess we worship will be robbed. And the people immediately respond with rage and defensiveness, and absolute pandemonium breaks out. Okay, this is so cool. Watch this. When they heard this, they were enraged, and they shouted, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians," or something like that. The city was filled with confusion, and people rushed together to the theater, dragging with them Gaius and, I've mispronounced that name every time, but that guy with an A, Macedonians who were Paul's travel companions. Paul wished to go into the crowd, but the disciples would not let him. Even some officials of the province of Asia who were friendly to him sent him a message urging him not to venture into the theater. Now, meanwhile, some were shouting one thing, some another, for the assembly was in confusion, and most of them didn't know why they had come together. Some of the crowd gave instructions to Alexander, whom the Jews had pushed forward, and Alexander motioned for silence and tried to make a defense before the people. But when they recognized that he was a Jew, for about 2 hours, all of them shouted in unison, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." So the finer details of how this thing starts to spread are not available to us, but what Luke tells us is that in short order, the theater was filled with an angry mob. Here's what the theater looks like. You can still go there today. This is the largest theater in Asia, seats 25,000 people. Yeah, they do still have concerts there. Elton John played there. Interesting that most of the people who gather here in this stadium don't know why they're there, but they're angry. Okay, all they know is that something is happening in the city and that they've been invited to be a part of this riot that's happening. And this is an epic scene. Luke describes it in a very Lucan way. He says, it was not a small disturbance. It wasn't small. And I picture this whole thing in movie form. Okay, so picture thousands of people rushing together in chaos, dragging 2 of Paul's companions with them. Many of the people are already chanting and shouting, but it's not unified. It's not a unified chant. And so it sounds like just mass hysteria. No one really knows what to think or exactly what's going on. Paul is somewhere in town. We don't know exactly where, but he's ready to fight. He actually wants to go, stand in front of this crowd, and make a case, right? But the disciples are like, no, you are not doing that. It says, Luke says he wanted to go, but the disciples wouldn't let him. I don't know if they're physically restraining him. I don't know if they're standing in front of the doors like, you are not going because this is not going to end well. We even know that city officials were sending messages to Paul saying, do not think about it. Don't come out here. This could be really, really bad. Do not come here. Well, finally, in the midst of all this chaos, finally a guy named Alexander gets pushed to the stage to say something, and he motions for silence, and you can imagine all of this mass hysteria kind of taking a few minutes to die down. And then he began to speak in order to make a defense to the people. But when they found out that Alexander was a Jew, the boo birds come out, and the people started chanting, "Great is the Artemis of the Ephesians," not for 2 minutes, not for 20 minutes, but for 2 straight hours. 2 straight hours. Have you ever read the 1972 book, Alexander and the Terrible, Horrible, No Good, Very Bad Day? Yeah, that book is not about this guy, but it should have been, because this is the only event that people will ever remember Alexander for. There's some evidence that that this guy is the same guy that caused Paul a bunch of trouble. In his letter to Timothy, he said, imagine Paul writing this about you. He says, Alexander, the coppersmith, did many evil things to me, and the Lord will repay him according to his works. So I don't know if Paul just, heard about this speech and was like, man, he totally failed or what. But there's some evidence to suggest that this could have been the day that Alexander was kind of sympathetic to the Christians, got up to try to defend Paul, and because of that, gained a real bad name for himself among the people of his trade, and ended up then spending the rest of his life trying to destroy Paul, even traveling to Rome to testify against him later. We don't know for sure, but it could have been. Eventually, people's voices do get tired of chanting. You can't chant for too long. You can't say, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians," that many times without being like, I'm getting tired of this, let's stop. So the crowd quiets down, and the town clerk steps onto the stage to try to do what Alexander could not, which is prevent this from getting really bad. And here's a speech he gives. Citizens of Ephesus, who is there that does not know that the city of the Ephesians is the temple keeper of the great Artemis and of the statue that fell from heaven? Since these things cannot be denied, you ought to be quiet and do nothing rash. You have brought these men here who are neither temple robbers nor blasphemers of our goddess. In other words, Christianity is not a threat, okay? It's not a threat. It's all calm down. If you have a complaint, if Demetrius and the artist, if you have a complaint against him, the courts are open and there are proconsuls. Let them bring charges there against one another. If there's anything further you want to know, it must be settled in the regular assembly, for we're in danger of being charged with rioting today, since there is no cause that we can give to justify this commotion. When he said this, he dismissed the assembly. Now, what Luke doesn't tell us is what happened next. He walked off the stage, dropped the mic, looked at Alexander and said, "That's how it's done, man." This settles things down, and Paul stays a little bit longer before leaving. But Demetrius had this fear, and it was actually a legitimate fear. He was actually right, because by the end of the 4th century, almost everyone in Ephesus had become a Christian. And in the year 401, they got together, had a big party, and they tore down that temple. They tore down the temple of Artemis. So his fears were legit. He was actually right when he said, this message, it confronts the basis of what we believe. It will change everything if we let it be, if we let it thrive in our city. And it did. So what do we do with this? Well, I think the point is consistent with what we've seen many times in Acts already, that the good news about Jesus and his kingdom is disruptive. It does challenge assumptions. It does push on our worldview. It does confront our worship of other gods. Now, like I said in the beginning, we probably don't know anyone that worships one of these mythological gods or goddesses. And most of us don't have little statues or shrines in our home that we bow down to and worship. But that doesn't mean that we don't elevate things to the place of God in our lives. This is something of a human tendency that we've inherited from our fathers and mothers, to take created things and to set them in the seat of creator. How do I know this? Well, when God delivered the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt, and he brought them to the foot of the mountain, and he was giving them the commandments, and basically saying, you're going to live as God's people on the earth, and kind of here are the guidelines that help you do that. The first two, we call this the Decalogue or the Ten Commandments. The first two of these are as follows: worship me as God alone. Second one, don't make any images of me or bow down to anything you make. So it's something that we as humans have a tendency to do, and it's something that we're not exempt from right here in America in 2018. Now, before I go on, a little disclaimer. I know that this is overdone, right? If you've been in church for any period of time, you probably have heard a message about the idols in our life, or the gods that we maybe, or the things that we make as gods. But I don't want you to hear this as cliche. Don't hear it as condemning. Don't hear it as sin management. Hear it as an invitation to freedom. Because what these things do, these fake gods, they hold us hostage. They keep us broken. They promise to do something that they can't deliver. Now, a god can be defined as something in your life which we've given excessive time, passion, or devotion to. Or you might say a god is something we worship. God is something we worship. So I heard Louis Giglio define worship once as our response to what we value most. In other words, we can worship anything. Just a matter of what we value. That's what we give our worship to. Worship is not reserved for like something like this. Dave said worship is not limited. That's kind of the way that he talked about giving earlier. Worship's not limited. So worship's not even limited to just upward to our God and King. It's not. A worship can be to anything. We can give our worship to anything. And in America, we do that. We do worship a lot of things. And so, even though we maybe can't resonate with these people that we just read about, in Ephesus that have all of these shrines and gods devoted to Jupiter and Mars and Apollo and Nike and all of these people, we can relate to that struggle of having things in our life that call us to worship. What are some of the modern ones? What are some of our modern gods? Well, how about the god of media, the goddess of success, the goddess of information, and the god of substances? What do I mean by that? Okay. Anyone have a device glued to your hand most of the time, looking at your social media for connection, for friendship, for validation? Anyone trapped in a porn addiction? How about this? Anyone's life pretty well consumed by winning in some industry? Are you obsessed with making money? Have you sacrificed your family on the altar of success? Anyone spend too much time consuming Netflix or Fox News or ESPN or reading Wikipedia? Do you obsessively watch the news cycle? Anyone dependent on consuming substances to get through your day or to fall asleep at night? Alcohol, opiates, McDonald's? There's plenty more, right? And they're different for all of us. But here's the thing. We end up worshiping those things because they claim to meet certain needs that we have. And then we find out that they can't deliver. That's the problem with a fake God. For instance, like alcohol promises to take the edge off so you can sleep, promises to help you numb yourself from your problems, but when you wake up, your problems are still there, right? So alcohol doesn't actually solve any of your problems. Porn promises adventure and satisfaction, but it doesn't deliver those things. It actually leaves you unfulfilled and ashamed. Social media promises connection, but we are statistically the most lonely country in the history of the world by a long shot. We have connection with hundreds and thousands of people, but we have no community, right? So social media, too, promises something that it can't deliver. All of these fake gods, they promise a better future, but all they do is just enslave us. And none of these gods and goddesses deserve to be handed lordship in our lives because they can't be trusted. They can't come through. So sex, money, media, substances, and information, these are all created things. Okay, they're all created things. And they all have their place. But they can't sit in the place that they don't belong. And that's when we get into trouble, right? When we take created things and put them in the seat of creator. These things can't be trusted. You can't put things on pedestals that don't belong there. They'll fall off and they'll break. We already know that. We already know that intellectually, but the battle for this is actually deeper within us. It takes place in our hearts. There is a battle for who or what is king of our heart. There's a constant battle for who or what is king of our heart. And the good news about Jesus and his kingdom comes strong in that battle. I mean, it brings it in that battle. And it confronts our worship of those things, not in a condemning way, but as an invitation. It says, like, you don't have to be a slave anymore. You can actually be freed from that. It invites us back into trust of him. So the teachings of Jesus that make us most uncomfortable or defensive are probably revealing things we've elevated to a godlike status in our lives. Whenever we hear teaching from Scripture and we're like, I don't like, there's something about that makes me uncomfortable and defensive. It's probably highlighting something that we've elevated to a godlike status in our life. Example, if every time you hear a teaching about what Jesus had to say about money, if you get uncomfortable and defensive, it could be highlighting that you have placed money like up here where it doesn't belong. That feeling I can only describe as like it's in your belly and it feels like fire. It feels like anxiety a little bit when we hear the truth that Jesus tells us. And it's akin to something shaking our worldview. We saw these people in Ephesus that when the good news about Jesus and his kingdom came there, it rocked their city. It shook the foundations of their city. And that's what the gospel does in our hearts. It challenges our core assumptions. And it rocks us to our core. It causes us to ask some really difficult questions about who we are and where we have placed our trust. So the gospel actually invites us to take trust away from those things and lay them down at the feet of Jesus with the premise that he is good. He's good. One of the things that I think is sometimes mischaracterized in like a church setting is sin. Like that's a scary word. We talk about sin and all that. Here's like what I believe sin is. Sin is rooted. It's like an action that's rooted in a belief that God isn't good. That's all sin is. Sin is like saying, I know God, you created things to be this certain way. I don't believe it though. I don't think that's the best way. So I'm going to live outside of that. You know what happens when we live outside of that? Brokenness is perpetuated over and over and over and over again. That's what sin does. It just perpetuates brokenness. And so the message of Jesus is calling us out of that brokenness and saying like, you can be whole, you can be restored, you can have trust and faith again in this God who created everything with good intentions, who is himself good, who wants us to trust him. And so we leave those other things behind, we lay them down, and we lay them at his feet and say, I trust you. I want to trust you. This is basically the way that you can simplify the whole story of the Bible is God wants humans to trust him. God wants humans to trust him. He wants you to trust him because he's good. For a few, you throwing stuff back there? For a few minutes, here's kind of how we're going to wrap this up. I'd like you to sit and reflect on this, on a few questions. One is, who or what is king of your heart? Who or what is king of your heart? And what is obviously jockeying for that position in your heart? Is there something, right? If you're like, I can't think of anything, you're not really being honest with yourself. Like there is something. What is jockeying for that position? Fighting for that position in your heart as king and ruler. And then just ask, can you trust it? Like, is that thing trustworthy? Does it deliver what it says it delivers? Jesus says, come to me, lay your burdens down. All of you who have these heavy weights and burdens on you, lay them down, and I'll give you rest. I'll give you peace. Like you'll actually have peace that's deeply seated in you. And that's something we all long for. Would you close your eyes and just think on these two questions? Or a few, there's more than two. Who or what is king of your heart? What is obviously jockeying for that position in your heart? Can you trust it?